Hey guys, welcome back. So today we are going to be talking about first wave feminism in the progressive era. And I know that first wave feminism is a term that we used last unit, and I think that we should probably go ahead and define actually what this means. So first wave feminism is a period of feminist activism and organizing that spans 1848, which is when the Seneca Falls Convention was, right here, the first women's rights convention in the US, to 1920, which is when women officially gained the right to vote. It's called first wave feminism because there are going to be other waves of feminism that we'll talk about later on this unit. But for this specific time period, there are some gains for sure. We do see more women enter the workplace, more women have educational opportunities. We also end with the 19th Amendment, which is female suffrage. However, there are definitely some limitations as well. This movement was very racially and socioeconomically exclusive. It was mostly a movement for and by wealthy white women. And so subsequent waves of feminism are going to have to deal with the fact that, well, yes, there is the 19th Amendment and there are more gains for women. They're mostly only gains for white women. And so we'll look to see how other women of different races and ethnicities and socioeconomic classes are going to be included in the feminist movement moving on in the 20th century. Okay, so let's kind of talk about the role of women at the turn of the 20th century. So, in the beginning of the 1900s, what are our female experiences? There's still this expectation that women kind of stay in the home. This was specifically for wealthy women, this cult of domesticity idea. We do know that, though, that wealthy women used some of their free time to get involved in reform movements like the temperance movement that we'll talk about in a minute. We also mentioned last unit that Western women seemed to have more equality and more rights because in the West, the gender roles, the traditional gender roles, just weren't really enforced that much, and they were a little unclear. There were a lot of single women in the West who owned their own farms and who owned, their own property, and even some Western states gave women the right to vote before the 19th Amendment. So gender equality just was more prevalent in the West than it was in the East. We also know that women were entering the workplace around the country. In the South and West, farming was very popular. In the North, working in factories as unskilled workers was popular, but getting paid less than their male counterparts. And nationwide, women dominated the domestic occupations, things like being maids or cooks or servants. It was a traditionally female occupation nationwide. There were some skilled occupations that were available to women, but they technically required higher education or training. So usually these skilled occupations, like being a teacher, a nurse, or a secretary, they were typically only open to middle and upper class women who could afford an education. But by 1890, about 1/3 of all college students in America were actually female, which is a huge success and accomplishment. However, most females were still not allowed to get certain types of degrees, like medical degrees. They could be a nurse, but not a doctor. They weren't allowed to enter business programs or law schools. Let's talk about the temperance movement, though, because this is one of those reform movements that was largely dominated by females. The temperance movement is a movement to limit or ban alcohol consumption. Many people at this time believed that alcohol led to immoral behaviors like cheating on your wife and destroying the family or leading to, criminal behaviors. And so it was a goal of the temperance movement to ban alcohol in the hopes of stopping those things. The temperance movement was largely also a Christian movement. And we can see this with the most popular temperance organization of the time period, known as the Women's Christian Temperance Union. Ooh, it's a mouthful. At their height of popularity in the 1920s, they had over 700,000 members. One of their techniques they would use is they would go to bars and sing hymns, or they would pray outside of bars. But they also supported other things besides just temperance. They would support women's suffrage, an 8-hour workday, higher wages for women and all workers. However, their biggest goal was to stop the consumption of alcohol. A lot of women in the Women's Christian Temperance Union kind of believed that it was their their holy war against alcohol. We can see that in this cartoon here, this Joan of Arc kind of symbolism where she is fighting against whiskey and gin and rum and brandy, this kind of alluding to a holy war against alcohol. If you wanted to put a face on the temperance movement, it would probably be Carrie Nation's face right over here. Carrie Nation was known for attacking bars with a hatchet. She would literally go into bars and break up beer bottles, liquor bottles. She would, hit the bar itself with her hatchet. She didn't hit people, but she did destroy a lot of property, and that was illegal to destroy private property. And so she was jailed often. However, that just led to her becoming more popular and gaining more support. In this image over here, you can see she has a hatchet in one hand, and in the other hand, she has a Bible. So again, showing that this was a predominantly Christian movement as well. But all of this temperance activism actually ends up succeeding with the 18th Amendment, which was passed in 1919, which made it illegal to make, transport, or sell alcohol. It was not illegal to drink alcohol, but it was illegal to make it, transport it, or sell it. We'll talk more in Unit 4 about the Roaring Twenties when you have these secret bars called speakeasies, and you have, the rise of what eventually becomes NASCAR with these really fast cars that are designed to transport alcohol quickly. We'll look at that a little bit later on, but the 18th Amendment is eventually repealed in the 1930s because when the Great Depression occurs, the federal government is also struggling for money, and they recognized that they could make alcohol legal and tax it at really high rates and be able to gain federal revenue from that. So it was an economic decision later on to reverse the 18th Amendment. But for about 20-ish years, alcohol production and sale was made illegal in the United States. All right, let's talk about the suffrage movement, because that's probably what you're thinking of when it comes to, this time period. So we kind of mentioned this earlier. There were some states, specifically in these western states, these pink ones here, and a few eastern, Michigan and New York, that actually allowed women to vote before the 19th Amendment. Women did have some other rights too. They could possibly vote in some elections. In some places, like in these states, they were allowed to vote only in the presidential election. But definitely in some states, these blue ones here, they were not allowed to vote at all. But regardless of, what the state of voting rights was around the country, any female suffrage laws were not federally guaranteed or protected. So at any time, a state could just repeal female suffrage and make it illegal for women to vote again. And women wanted this right to be officially protected. So let's talk about some of the famous women's rights activists and organizations during this time period. Before we talk about this, I know that there are a lot of names on this slide. You don't need to know specifically what each person did. You just need to know in general that these women were involved in the struggle for women's rights and women's suffrage. So let's start off with Susan B. Anthony. She's right here. She founded the National American Women's Suffrage Organization. This was open to all women of all races. However, they did hold racially segregated events. Carrie Chapman Catt, she becomes the president of the National American Women's Suffrage Association after Anthony, and she's known for putting increasing pressure on Wilson to support female suffrage during World War I. She would have pickets at the White House and protests at the White House to say, you're focusing on international affairs, but you can't solve the problems right here in front of your face. Florence Kelley, she's right here. She was a prominent suffragette, which means a woman who wanted the right to vote. She also was an influential labor and child rights activist, and she also focused on racial equality. So she was interested in various types of activism at the time. Josephine St. Pierre Ruffin, she is right here. She founded the National Association of Colored Women. They fought for more educational opportunities and equal protection and enforcement of the law, specifically for Black women and children. And then Alice Paul, she is right here. She founded the National Women's Party. So this is a political party itself. And she also organized protests at the White House. She and her followers were often arrested and they would be put in jail. And then she supported hunger strikes in jail, so telling women, not to eat as a form of protest. Oftentimes, these women would be force fed. They would have tubes stuck down their throat and forcibly fed so that they didn't, pass out or die. But they definitely held their ground with these hunger strikes, trying to protest even from the jail cell. We need to talk, though, about the influence of World War I on female suffrage. We'll talk about World War I specifically next unit, but it did definitely kind of speed up the right to vote for women. Some women believed that the US should focus on its own issues before getting involved in global affairs, so they didn't agree with US involvement in World War I. One example is Jeannette Rankin. She was the first woman elected to Congress. She was from Montana, and she was the only Congress person to vote against US involvement in World War I, specifically because she believed the US should focus on its own issues first. But some women supported U.S. involvement in World War I. They saw it as a patriotic gesture, supporting America and proving that, they should, also have the right to vote because they supported it. And many women, as a result of World War I, entered the workforce and supported war efforts, either, domestically or abroad, becoming nurses or typewriters in the military, or they could fly planes. They would also run ambulances. They couldn't actually fight as soldiers, but they served in a lot of support roles. And this caused a lot of pressure to be put on Wilson and the US government to support women's rights because they were fighting for America too. They were supporting America and America should support them. And eventually that argument won. And in 1920, the 19th Amendment was ratified, granting women the right to vote nationwide. However, while this is a huge gain in first wave feminism, it is important to recognize that many women would remain disenfranchised or not allowed to vote through various discriminatory practices. That would include poor women, immigrant women, Black women. So they are still going to struggle to have their voices heard in the government despite the 19th Amendment. Okay, so hopefully at this point you are able to talk about what first wave feminism is, what the role of women was around the turn of the 20th century. You should be able to discuss the temperance movement and its consequence, which was the 18th Amendment. And then lastly, with the suffrage movement, you should be able to talk about some of the women who were involved in the suffrage movement, as well as World War I's influence on the suffrage movement, and then lastly, the adoption of the 19th Amendment.